I look like a hot mess, let me just tell you. Let's see. I am in my bedroom this morning because this is the only place that I can comfortably sit with the little one. I've got a pile of laundry behind me that needs to get done today, and another pile sitting in front of me that needs to get done today. All right, so forgive me. I was not around last week. Everett was actually sick last week, and I had this weird cough that I could not get rid of. And so it was kind of pointless to do a live stream if I'm coughing and you can't hear me talk. So I decided to skip the live stream last week and just do 2 weeks in one, and it kind of worked out perfect because it was all the book of Exodus and it kind of just all went together. So I thought it was really okay. So we are doing week 4 and 5 recap and discussion this week. We are done with the first month of the Bible study. Yay! It was wonderful, wasn't it? So I gotta tell you guys that Exodus was extremely hard for me to read. It was, I mean, I'm just, for the sake of transparency, it was just extremely boring. Like, I never realized that the story of Moses was just so monotonous. I mean, so monotonous. I felt like, you know, God was constantly repeating himself throughout the entire book. And it was hard for me. This was a hard read for me. And I'm sitting there the whole time thinking, oh my gosh, is it ever going to end? Like, so I don't know that I'll have much input this week, but I do want to walk through it because it is really important. The entire book of Exodus is really important to the believer. And so there are some things that I want to talk about, and I'll just briefly go through the story with you. Before we get started, if you have not joined us in reading the Bible through the year, there's still time. I mean, we're just now getting into Exodus. You could probably sit down and read the whole book of Genesis and Exodus in a week, you know, if you really did it like every single day. But if you want to join us, you can go to my blog. I will link. You can actually go to the original YouTube video and find the information there, or you can go to my blog, thefuelhomestead.com, and get the information off of there in one of the blog posts. And then you can actually find this handy dandy cheat sheet that tells you once you catch up. Boo. 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 That helps you kind of read through the week. Okay. Let's get to Exodus. Okay, so the story of Moses, quick rundown. The Israelites were oppressed in Egypt. We get to the birth of Moses. The Pharaoh at the time was basically saying, kill all of these babies, all of the boys, because, good morning, Nikki. I kept reading things over because I thought, yeah, I kept doing the same thing. I kept reading, I'm like, didn't I just read this? Especially towards the end of Exodus, it was really like, oh my gosh, Lord, did you have to repeat yourself 100 times? So we get to the birth of Moses. We all know this story vividly. You know, Moses' mother, she didn't want him to be killed, so instead she put him in a basket and sent him down the river. And you know, the Pharaoh's daughter found him and wanted to keep him. And so, funny enough, Moses' mother actually got to nurse him until he was of weaning age, and then he went back to live with the Pharaoh's daughter. So, I think I actually touched on this last week, how, you know, Moses' mother was able to raise him until he was weaned, and then she had to give him away. I just can't imagine doing that. I can't imagine having to do that, but I guess, you know, her love for him, crazy things you'll do when you're a mom. Her love for him was outweighed that. So when Moses got older, you know, he fled Egypt, and it was really all probably part of God's plan. Good morning. Oh, thanks for joining us. Hopefully you're caught up. If not, you have time since we're only in February. Basically, you know, God came to Moses and said, my people are oppressed. I'm choosing you to, fix this, and Moses didn't think he was qualified, and we all think that a lot, right? We all think we're not qualified, and God qualifies the unqualified. And that was a really great moment when Moses was kind of fighting with God in chapter 1 and 2, like, do you know who I am? Like, I don't even talk right. And God was still used him. So, and that was actually in chapter 4, verse 10. Moses said to the Lord, "Pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue." And the Lord said, "Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say." I thought that was really encouraging. Let's see. All right, so we go through the story of Moses. Again, I don't have a lot of notes, but I do have some. So we start going through the plagues. And consistently we hear that God is hardening Pharaoh's heart. And he says this to Moses over and over again. I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart, and then I'll send a plague, or I'll send this judgment. And you're kind of left thinking, why? Why not just let Pharaoh, make this decision and say, okay, let these people go, goodbye. But it wasn't just about Pharaoh. It was about the whole country. And as you keep reading that, these plagues that God sends on Egypt, you realize God isn't wanting to just make himself real to Pharaoh. He's wanting to make himself real to an entire country. So if you were to go into theology and the humetrics or whatever you call it, you would probably see something even more horrible happening in Egypt, not, other than what was already happening. So obviously God had judgment for that country, and it was really interesting and kind of horrible to read through all that. One of the interesting notes that I have is in chapter 7, where God turned all the water to blood. When you're a kid, or even now when you watch movies, oh, it's the rivers and the oceans and all that stuff. But I thought it was interesting that, I'm not sure what verse it is. Anyhow, it's between verse 14 and 22. He didn't just turn the river to blood. He turned all the water, even stored water, to blood. Sorry, I'm trying to make sure I don't miss any notes. Any comments, and my mother-in-law texting me at the same time. I thought it was really interesting. See, I never knew that. Like, it never occurred to me that not only did he do the rivers and the seas and all that stuff, but he actually, any vat of water that was there, he turned to blood. So it was pretty crazy. They had no water, no water that they could drink. It was that alone would have been like, okay, I take you seriously, but. And I thought it was really interesting, through all of these plagues, they had magicians even then that could duplicate it, which is almost really concerning when you think about it, especially if you've ever read through Revelation. And it talks about how the beast and the Antichrist and even just people in general will be able to do these signs and wonders that aren't of God. That's a little crazy, So we really have to use discernment even now as we go into modern times. Let's see. Okay, so in chapter 10, we were talking about Pharaoh's heart being hardened. It says, verse 1 says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his officials, so that I may perform these signs of mine among them, that you may tell your children and grandchildren how I dealt harshly with the Egyptians, and how I performed my signs among them, and that you may know that I am the Lord.'" So these acts, it was so much more than the Israelites and Pharaoh. It was very much, history. This is. Do you have pants on?
Yes.
What?
You want me to take him?
No, he's fine. Go on. Go do what you're supposed to do. It was very much for the history of the Israelites, that this would be something that would be passed on, this story would be passed on forever, of how God dealt so harshly with Egypt because they had oppressed the Jewish people. And we can even see that now. I mean, that the Jewish people are so close to God's heart. So something else that was interesting for me was that Pharaoh, he continued to sin. He continued to make unwise decisions. And yet he continued to ask for forgiveness. Okay? So this was just a perfect example of an unrepentful heart, and why God was dealing with Egypt so harshly. Because, so in chapter 10, verse 17, or let's go to verse 16. Pharaoh quickly summoned Moses and Aaron and said, I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you. Now forgive my sin once more and pray to the Lord your God to take away this deadly plague from me. Do we do that? Do we do that? Like, that hit me like a ton of bricks. Oh my goodness, I could be a Pharaoh sometimes. Like, I can be, oh God, I'm so sorry, for this or this and that. Now take this away from me, And then I'm probably going to go and do the same thing over again. Or how many people in our lives do we know that do that? But we all have done it or do it to some extent. And so I kind of chuckled at that. But then it was just heavy at the same time, because it was like Pharaoh said, he's sinning. He keeps sinning throughout this whole book of the Bible. He's asking for forgiveness. Bless you. And then he keeps on going back and sinning, but but it's God's fault. He expects God to heal and to deal with it, not himself. And that's just a prime example of how we are. In the first part of Exodus, the one verse that really weighed on me, because I don't know, I'm a words person, and so I really pay attention to words that are used. So in chapter 10, again, verse 21, this is the plague of darkness. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward the sky so that darkness spreads over Egypt, darkness that can be felt. We have never experienced darkness like that, not that I can imagine. It literally says that no one could see, in verse 23, no one could see anyone else or move about for 3 days. Yet the Israelites had light in the places where they lived. Can you imagine not being able to see just because there was so much darkness around you? Not being able to see. That's crazy. That's insanity. Like, I have read the Bible, and that never even occurred to me or stuck out to me at all. And not something that there's, I tell my son often asks me, how do you, I try to give him examples of ways that our minds are not like God's mind. And I said, and I always say, consider this, when you get to heaven, there's going to be colors that you've never even seen. And so then the challenge is, can you think of a new color? No, you can't. You can't think of a new color, because your mind can think up colors, but it's just a mishmash of colors that you've already seen. You're just mashing them together. And so when I was reading this, I was thinking about that, because, what I would never think in a million years that I would be in such a dark place that I wouldn't be able to see my hand in front of me. You know what I mean? For 3 days. That's crazy. God's thoughts, he does it for reasons. Obviously, this was the plague of Egypt, but it was just really interesting to read through those plagues. And it says a darkness that can be felt. That's what God did for that plague, and that's just crazy. So going into chapter 11, we are really circling. It's interesting how this is the plague where Pharaoh is like, get the heck out of here. And it is the plague of the firstborn. It's where God says that he's going to take all the firstborn children that evening when he comes. And, if the blood isn't on the door and things like that, that he will take the firstborn. I think it's interesting how in the beginning of Exodus, this is exactly what Pharaoh in Egypt was doing. They were killing babies. And you don't kill innocent babies without having a judgment on you. And that is really concerning for America right now, too, and any other country that is literally legalizing murder. And there's always a circle back around. And that's funny that it was the last plague that God went through before Pharaoh and Egypt really started paying attention. And God took all of their firstborn. All of them. Not just the humans, but of their livestock and animals. It was a crazy situation. And so we circle back around to the death of children. Pharaoh was killing children in the beginning of Exodus, and now God's taking Pharaoh's children. God's taking the children of Egypt. That's a big thing, you know, when you start thinking about it, and you start thinking about America right now and other countries that are legalizing abortion. Okay, so me being the herbalist nerd that I am, I'm looking in chapter 12. This is the Passover festival and all that stuff. In this is like total sidetrack. Verse 7, it says, "Then they are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs." So it's talking about eating lamb. "That same night they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire, along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast." So, as an herbalist, you know that bitter herbs actually help you digest food. And so I thought that was really interesting that God's kind of concerned, and it's just funny to see what God says about food in general and medicine in general and oils, anointing oils. We're going to get to that in a second in general. And how it actually helps us. Now we know in modern society, these are things we have to relearn, that it actually helps us digest food. So I thought that was just an interesting side note. We start going into, God talking about the feast and all that. Crossing into chapter 13, when it talks about crossing the Red Sea and things like that, we get to verse 17. It says, "When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. Israelites went up out of Egypt ready for battle. I wrote, God made them take the longer route and the harder route so that they wouldn't lose sight of him." And I thought that was interesting because God had said if they run into battle, then they might turn around and not keep going. And how many times do we, think, oh my gosh, something in our life is happening, or a project we're working on, or a baby. How long I waited for this baby right here. Waited for him for 9 years. 9 years for this baby. And it was just such a long, hard thing to travel through. And it made me think about him or other situations that have just taken longer or that were more difficult than I thought they should be. And in this, he says, if I'm not going to take them the easier route, because they could face this other issue that could cause them to lose sight and turn away from me. And so I thought that was a really important part of Exodus. And it was really encouraging to continue to just understand that God's ways are not our ways. And there's always a reason, Okay. I am moving way far in Exodus because some of these notes really don't pertain to our certain Bible study. I did make a note in chapter 17 that Amalekites, I wanted to kind of study that more. God says in chapter 17 that he's going to wipe the Amalekites off the earth, but it also says, because, this is in verse 16, he said, because hands were lifted up against the throne of the Lord will be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation. And if I had to guess, I'm no theologian, I would guess that this is talking about, hello, well, I'm glad you're listening while you're driving and not watching. I thought maybe if I had to take a guess, it's probably talking about Middle Eastern people that Israelites are constantly in battle with now. So I want to do some more study into that, but I just didn't have time this week to look at it. So I've made myself a note. If I do get time to do that this week, I will come back next week in the video and talk about it a little bit. Let's see, what else do I have? Oh, okay. All right, so in chapter 19, we're talking about Mount Sinai. So, God has all of these things, all of these lists of things he starts saying that, you're to do or not to do. And some of them you're just like, what? I mean, you're just like, God, are you okay up there? None of this makes sense. It seems really, really not necessary. And, oh, look, here's a new toy. There you go. And so a note that I wrote, it just kind of hit me. And because, you know, we don't live like they lived. We live in a modern society. We don't know what their culture was like unless we've really studied it in depth. And I wrote, while the ways of God seem weird to us in modern society, they may have been completely understandable to the Jewish people. So the Jewish people had certain sets of laws. They had certain rules and regulations. So, you know, God was talking to the Jewish people, the Israelites. So these commandments and these pieces of wisdom and instruction that God was giving may have made complete and total sense to them, and may be completely foreign to us because we don't live the lifestyle and the culture that they lived. So just keep that in mind when you're reading, especially in the Old Testament, and you think, oh, why the world would God say that? Well, these are probably the reasons why, and there are certain other things going on throughout that time that you're not aware of. Okay, so we're going to move to... Junior, come get him for a little bit. I'm almost done. We're going to move to chapter 23, and we are going to go to verse 27. Jew, I think your brother's not listening to me. Say hi, guys. Hi, guys. Brother's coming to get me. Brother's coming to get me. Just take him for like 10 minutes. I'll be done. All right, go.
Boo-doo.
Thank you. Hurry up and go so I can finish. All right. Chapter 23, verse 27, it says, I will send my terror ahead of you and throw into confusion every nation you encounter. So this is where Moses was concerned about people that him and the Israelites might encounter. How would they know, that he was of God and that what they were doing was from God? And God is basically sending his angel to prepare the way. And he says, I will send my terror ahead of you and throw into confusion every nation you encounter. Do you know that this still happens today? A lot of people wouldn't know that. But I follow people like Jack Hibbs and, I can't remember the other guy's name. But do you know how many times that Israel has been attacked? Or someone was going to attack Israel, and there's just been confusion. And in fact, there's a report from maybe 2 years ago where, Israel, this constant mumbo jumbo in the Middle East, and one of the encampments that was going to attack Israel, they had this preparation, this huge ordeal, and that really could have hurt Israel. And when asked why they didn't do it, the response was, we were just so confused. None of it just made sense. And it took me to this verse. And so God still does this today for the Israelites. He says, I will send my terror ahead of you and throw into confusion every nation you encounter. That was powerful for me. That was really an interesting thing to read, especially when you're aware of what's going on. Yes. Love. Yeah, that's who I'm talking about. Great people to follow. I will try to remember to link that when I'm done. All right, so then this is the part where I'm like, Lord. It took me forever to get through this next part where God is talking about making the tabernacle, which is really, really important. But I'm like, do I need to know how many cubits tall an angel is? Or do I need to know how many rings and gold rings that are on this pole? Or why do I need to know the intricacy of the lampstand? And I'm just like, and it repeats itself like 3 times between now and the end of Exodus. But it's really important. And it may not be important to you and me, but it is really important to know what the tabernacle looked like, and what God's plan was. So I don't know. Many of you may have seen, like, there's this picture, and it's really wall art. My parents have it, of the tabernacle, of how the tabernacle was set up, and it has the cloud. It says later in the Bible that the cloud of God, yeah, kind of like Numbers, kind of like Job too. Job is like, whew, Job, really, come on, buddy. but, the cloud of God is above it. And in Exodus we read, if the cloud of God was above the tabernacle, then people would go out and do their thing. But if it wasn't, that meant the cloud was inside the tabernacle, and people wouldn't go anywhere or do anything. It meant basically they were not safe to go anywhere. If it was above, they were. If it was below, they weren't. So it goes through the priestly garments, the lampstand, the Ark of the Covenant, the altar of incense. It's very interesting. I do encourage you to read it because it's very detailed, but it is very difficult to read through multiple times. So I'm skipping ahead all the way to chapter 30, and so I'll be honest with you, I had not finished reading this until last night. And I was sitting there, and in verse 22, it starts talking about the anointing oil for the priests. And it says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, take the following fine spices, 500 shekels of liquid myrrh, half as much, that is 250 shekels, of fragrant cinnamon, 250 shekels of fragrant calamus, 500 shekels of cassia, all according to the sanctuary shekel, and a hin of olive oil." So I underlined this, okay? And I wrote sacred anointing oil, and I wrote what was in the sacred anointing oil. I'm like, I'm going to try to make this. At the end of it, right down here, it says, "It is sacred, and you are to consider it sacred. Whoever makes perfume like this and puts it on anyone other than a priest must be cut off from their people." And I'm like, oh, I'm probably not going to make that then, because I'm not really sure if God wants me to make it. But I would really be interested in making it just to see what it smells like. But I don't know. I don't know if I'll ever do it. But if I do, I will let you guys know what it smells like. But I thought it was interesting. It's just myrrh, cinnamon, calamus, and cassia. And I have all of those except for calamus. So, I don't know. It'd be interesting to see. All right. So then we get to chapter 32. We're talking about the golden calf. This is where you're like, dudes. Israelite dudes. You have heard God. You have seen Moses talk to God. You have gone through a sea that was cut in half. And now you're going to make an idol after you've seen all this stuff. That's what you're going to do. So in verse 1, it says, "When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain." This is when Moses went up to get the 10 Commandments and all that. He was gone for 40 days, I think, is what it said. "They gathered around Aaron and said, 'Come, make us gods who will go before us.'" They were concerned that if they went, into other spaces where they're supposed to go to the promised land, that they would get into battle and they would die. And so they wanted a god that would go before them. Even though it was fake, and you're just like, you're wasting your time. It says, "Come make gods for us who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." We do this too. We do this. I wrote a note. Just like the Israelites, oftentimes when God takes longer than we think he should, we make our own idols. We make our own idols. We make our own gods. We make our own, based off of emotion, based off of, God, you're not going as quickly as I want you to do, so I'm going to do my own thing. And then we idolize ourselves. We go against what God's will is, or against what God has said to us, and then we try to make it happen on our own. And in fact, that's a resounding theme throughout Exodus. Even when you're reading it, you're like, oh God, can this please go faster? No. Read it. Take your time to reading it. And little things like this popped out to me. Just like the Israelites, when things aren't going fast enough, or when things are not quite what we wanted them to be, even though we know the truth, we still make our own gods. We still make our own idols. We still make our own decisions, even though we know what God told us to do. So I thought that was a really interesting aspect. In chapter 33, we see that God actually talks to Moses face to face as a friend. And when Moses would come out of where he was talking to God, his face would be glowing from talking to the Lord face to face. We see that the radiant face of Moses in chapter 34. We go into Sabbath regulations, how you're not supposed to work on the seventh day. If you're an Israelite, it says specifically the Jewish people. So I'm not going to touch on that. That's something, it's big. It's big for the Israelites, because it says any man or woman who works on the Sabbath day is to be completely cut off from your people. But in my opinion, God was completely addressing the Israelite people, not necessarily people as a whole. But then again, there's argument for that too. So I don't really know. I don't really know what the answer is to that. I mean, it even says during harvest season, you are not supposed to work on the seventh day. And so that's something I want to study more. I don't really know. I don't know. That's something I just need to study more. But it was interesting to read that portion of it. Then we get into building the tabernacle, setting it up, making the priestly garments. We have to read all of that all over again. And then we are at the end of Exodus. And now it does continue in Leviticus. We are going to continue the story of Moses in Leviticus. But I want to read the last part of Exodus. In chapter 40, verse 34, it says, "Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. In all the travels of the Israelites, whenever the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle, they would set out. But if the cloud did not lift, they did not set out until the day it lifted. So the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and fire was in the cloud by night, in the sight of all Israelites during all their travels." So the tabernacle, I mean, God was making himself known to the Israelites. It was really important for them to feel safe, and it was really important for God to make them feel safe. But all of these other things had to take place before this could happen. So Exodus is over. We are headed into Leviticus. Leviticus is pretty small. It's only 27 chapters. So we'll be done with that within probably next week, I guess. But I enjoyed Exodus. It was just very hard to get through, and there weren't a lot of tidbits that I could take out of it, but I feel like it was really important for the structure of history with the Bible and the Israelites and of God. So that portion of it, even if I don't need it now, even if it means nothing to me right now, it might mean something to me later down the road. So it's important for me. Remember, the whole point of reading the Bible is to hide God's word in your heart. So there might be something you see on TV that really resonates with you, and you might think, oh, well, that's in the Bible. Hey, that was in here. Especially going into end times, or it might be that you have a conversation with somebody and it comes up, and you can have that conversation because you read about it. So it's really interesting. I encourage you to read it. If you didn't read it, go back and reread it. If you skip through it, read it again, because obviously God puts it in there for a reason. In my opinion, when you read something over and over again, you remember it more. So God obviously wants us to remember the tabernacle for a reason. So I encourage you to go back and read it if you skipped over it, like I was tempted to do. And it's just really important. Okay, guys, that's it from me this week. We will continue the discussion in our group, the Homestead Homemaking for Christian Women and Friends group on Facebook. If you haven't joined it yet, you can. The stipulation is you need to be a woman. If you're a man, you can obviously join this Bible study too, but make sure you make your comments in the description of this video. And you guys, we can have conversation in the description of this video too. But we do post a weekly post where you can have a discussion under that weekly post. So I will try to go in and update that. And then I have some exciting news for you guys coming up. It's just taken longer than expected. It's not related to the Bible study, but for those who follow me, it's something that I've been working on for a while. And seeing Stringfield Farm pop up where she said she was listening in the car, it'll be something you can listen to in the car every week, hopefully. So I'm just trying to iron out all the details, and then we can have Bible study all the time, right? All right, guys, have a great day. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and share it and subscribe if you haven't already so you can get notifications. Bye!